Welcome everybody to this video providing some essay writing advice for SCIE1000 Philosophy module. This material has been put together by Joel Katsav and Pete Evans and me, Peter Ellerton. So we're going to talk to you today about what you need to know or understand about a philosophy essay so that you can be a bit more strategic in putting your module essay together. The first thing to understand about your essay is that it is an argument. Now that means that you're going to be making a claim and supporting it with reasons. Okay, so this is not something you're necessarily just researching. You're not looking at what other people's arguments are unless you're going to evaluate them yourself. So it's not just a report on what others say. This is about your position, your thinking, your argument. Okay, so what argument are you going to put together, and what reasons are you going to use as part of that argument? Now, importantly, the reasons that you use must be rationally persuasive. Okay, they have to be convincing to other people. So you have to be making a case that appeals to them rationally. Something that students often write, which is a bit like fingernails on the chalkboard in one way, is I strongly believe. Now, the point is that is not rationally persuasive at all. It doesn't matter that you strongly believe it. The real question is, why should someone else believe it? So if you're not in a position to lay out your thinking and be as rationally persuasive as possible, you won't be successful in convincing others that your conclusion, that your claim, is the most rational one. And more than that, it suggests that you don't have a particularly good reason for believing it yourself, which is an interesting other point to consider. So, the point about understanding the essay as an argument is that we can realize better that the structure of your thinking will end up being the structure of your essay. If you can get your thinking right, if you can get your argument well structured, then that becomes the structure of your essay. You see, many people might say things like, well, I know what I want to say, I just can't quite get the right words to say it, or I can't write it because I'm just not quite, there yet. But if they think it's because they know what they want to say but just can't get the words down, they're fooling themselves. In this type of essay at least, or this type of writing at least, if you don't know what to write, it's because you don't know what to think. So it's going to be critical to get your thinking right. In fact, most of your work is going to be getting your thinking right. And if you get that okay, you'll find that the essay is in fact quite a bit easier because of that work that you've done beforehand. Now, one of the ways that we can get our thinking right, of course, is to have a clear understanding of the content, the philosophical content. But if we want to flesh out some of the implications of that content and some possible arguments around it, then there are certain things you can do to get your thinking a bit clearer. For example, it helps a lot to talk to people, particularly to people who are doing the course, or not necessarily even doing the course, but trying to get a point across, your point across, about what you think about the rationality of some of these claims, or how they may sit, in accordance with the question. Talk it through, and as you talk it through, you'll find your thinking becomes clearer. And other people might be able to offer you some support, some critique of your reasoning, or some reasons that you haven't thought of in favour of your case. But you've got to do a fair bit of work in terms of reading and thinking and talking to your tutors, to your lecturers, and others, to make sure that you can get your thinking as clear and as well structured as possible. And when you have that, it's a great time to begin your writing. Now, one part of structuring your essay is to use indicator words to signpost your structure. It's very frustrating to read an essay and to not at all be clear about why the material you're reading is there. What's its job in the essay? Why is this being said? It's much more effective if you can lay out initially why it is that you're saying these things, so that people can read it with some context. And that helps them to concentrate on how you're saying what you're saying, rather than trying to figure out while they're reading and understanding what you're saying, how it fits together. Don't do some of that work for them so they don't have to do it themselves. It makes it much clearer on their part. So there are a number of ways we can understand the notion of indicator words. In the context of argumentation, at least, and the construction and evaluation of arguments, we want to have words that indicate the reasons that we're about to give. Words like since and because and given that and as a result of, which all suggest that we're offering reasons. What follows next will be a reason. And whatever reasons we therefore present will together suggest a possible conclusion. And words indicating that we're arriving at a particular conclusion include therefore, it follows that, so, hence, and so on. So some very simple structures, and we use those words quite a lot, but not everybody uses them with attention to argument structure. And you'll find that if you are thinking about how you're structuring your argument, positioning your reasons, and then showing how that leads to that conclusion, that those words can be more precisely used. Then I want to look at the idea of transition phrases. These are ways that we can connect particular ideas together so that the reader doesn't have to do the hard work of connecting one thing you say with another, because you're going to demonstrate what that connection is. So they include phrases like "I will begin by." Okay, you might start. That may be at the beginning of your essay, or it may be after you've introduced what you're going to do. Things like, before I say what is wrong with X's argument, I will first, and then whatever you think is appropriate there. Or at this point, we need to consider the following objection. So it's a very, very good way of helping people position themselves as they walk through the landscape of your reasoning, so that they can be led more easily where you want them to go. Not by tricking them, but by laying out a clear logical path that they find easy to follow. And transition phrases are just absolutely critical for doing that. Some more ideas would be, we've just seen how X says that P. I will now present two arguments against that. My first argument is, my second argument is. Now you might think that's just too simplistic to set it out like that, but it's not. It helps your reader enormously. And it helps your own thinking in how you want to prosecute your argument. So there's some more examples there of transition phrases that can be useful to make your argument structure clear to other people. To make it as simple as possible, to give you a really simple example, we might have something like this for the structure of a philosophy essay, or a particular kind of philosophy essay. We might say, I will argue for the view that Q, so that's your position, whatever Q is. And you might say there are three reasons to accept this position. First, second, third. And that's all very clear and straightforward. And then you'll say something like, perhaps the strongest objection to Q is. Now that's important because you're introducing a counter-argument. You're introducing something that could potentially derail your argument, and then you're going to show why it doesn't. Point out why that's not the way to go. The importance of having a counter-argument can't be understated, because when you're putting forth your argument, you might find that your reader is thinking about a particular counter-argument, and they're saying, yes, well, I hear what you're saying, but what about? And that what about in their minds will really undermine your argument. So what you want to say is, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking we ought to go this way, and here's why we shouldn't. Okay, so you address that issue for them and show why it's not the best path. Okay, so that's an example. It's a very simple way of doing it. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not as sophisticated as some other ways might need to be if you have a more complex argument. But again, that's context dependent. So we do want to keep it simple, unless you can't. Now, there are certainly reasons for complexity. We deal with complex ideas sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't pay to oversimplify them. But sometimes you don't need to say things as in the most complex way. Sometimes sophisticated ideas can be gotten across in more or less understandable and straightforward language. So I think what we want to do is try and keep that pressure to be as simple and clear in our language as we can, unless we can't, and that's understandable. So some ideas for you along that line to help you say what you mean. So you are attempting to demonstrate that you understand the philosophy. That's one thing you're trying to do. Okay, so but you're also trying to present your reasoning. So we as markers are interested in your understanding of the content, but also how you're reasoning with it. And both of those things need to be clear in your essay. You can't just report on the content. We won't see any of your thinking, and that won't get you where you need to be. So do make your language simple as it can be. Stick to the point and don't waffle on. Now, you might find it tempting to add a few of your, extra special words in there occasionally, but if it's not helping, don't do it. Okay, you don't want to pad out your essay with unnecessary words. I'll talk about that in a minute. And there's a kind of guide you might want to think about here. This is pretty true in most cases. It's that whenever you use a word to try and sound clever, you have the opposite effect. Okay, so just have that mantra running through your head whenever you think, well, maybe if I say it this way, it'll sound better. Yeah, possibly not. So be very careful about that. Okay. Now remember, you're writing for your peers. An intelligent peer who perhaps doesn't know the material, and you're trying to explain what the concepts are. And this is an interesting idea because it helps you to filter your essay. What are you going to say in 1,000 words? So you only need to explain what you need to explain to get the point across, and nothing else. You don't have to include other stuff, just what you need. Now, that might change depending upon what your argument is. For a particular argument, you may need to emphasize certain aspects of the course and de-emphasize others, and a different argument might have a different profile. So think about what people may or may not understand as it pertains to your argument, and also how they may challenge your claims. So what counter-arguments will you put together? And of course, examples are very useful, so feel free to use them as you can, and perhaps even test them out on your colleagues before you put them in your essay to see if they do the job properly. So the idea of simplicity is this: an engine doesn't have any unnecessary parts. You don't see levers and screws and pulleys and chains when you don't need them. And a philosophy essay, at least of this sort, should have no unnecessary words. Okay, just put in words that you need. Every word has a job. In particular, every paragraph has a job. You should be able to point to a particular paragraph and say, the job of this paragraph in this essay is to do this. Okay, and you should just include what you need for that to happen. It's the same thing with a sentence. The building blocks of essays really aren't words, they're sentences. The sentences are the smallest things that can really properly encapsulate an idea. So think about the sentence. Does the sentence, do all the words in the sentence do the job you need? Are there any unnecessary words? And think about it that way as you move on. Now, it's also very important to appreciate that this is your argument that you're prosecuting. Again, you're not reporting on someone else's argument unless you're evaluating it for us, your reader. So ultimately, this is about your position and your argument, how you've synthesized all the material and the argument that you are constructing. It means that very often that the object of what we're writing about is you and your thinking. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. So if the thing we're talking about is your thinking, or the thing you're talking about is your thinking, it makes perfect sense to invoke the first person grammatical perspective. So we may have examples such as, I will argue that. Okay, so you are the one arguing. You need not say, it can be argued that, because we just say, well, by who? So by you. So it's your argument. So it's much clearer, and it's a way of being accountable for your reasoning. Okay, we appreciate your taking ownership. This is my position, this is my argument. I'm going to argue this. You might also say things like, well, I find X's argument unconvincing for the following reasons. And then you lay out what your reasons are. And the reason that you're saying, I find X's argument unconvincing, is because we're assessing your thinking. So, okay, why don't you? What are your reasons? We want to see that. Invoking the first person grammatical perspective doesn't mean beginning every sentence with I think. That's not how it works. It's when you need to focus on your thinking or make your thinking the object of study, that's when you write it. So you can move between them. There isn't really something that's written in the first person or not. You just invoke it as required. Sometimes an essay may have the word I or we just once in the whole essay, because that's when we're talking about our thinking or our position or our reasoning, something like that. So there's a power to writing in the first person, and it's very common in philosophy essays. For that reason, we are interested in the argument. So there's some basic ideas for you to give you a strategy to approach your philosophy essay. You'll hear more about this in tutorials and a little bit in lectures, but it's worthwhile thinking ahead so you can plan how you will come up with your argument.